Good evening, one and all! All, like 8 of you. And welcome to what is most definitely the 23rd ordinary meeting of the 170th session of the Queen's University of Belfast Literary and Scientific Society. So as always, we're going to begin with some announcements. So the first announcement, I bet you're wondering, that's not Papa Dobbin at the front. Who dat? It's me, Matthew Bradley. Why am I here? It's because the Litterific has been nominated for a Students' Union Award. And Mr. Doblin is away at the Sesh in the Whitler Hall, I believe, to see if we will win this evening. If we win, we will let you know. So, there we go. So, as many of you will know, last night was the annual Conversazione, our annual formal, and I hope you all had a really good time there. There's so few of you. I was thinking, I'm going to work the crowd this evening, but I straight up can't.
You can work me, Matthew.
No. So I bet you're wondering, are you reading the minutes this week? Well, no, I'm not. Because we are very lucky to have our wonderful treasurer, Mr. Shea Glasgow, reading the minutes for you. So, Mr. Shea Glasgow, it's your time.
Is this it? No, is this it?
Yeah, this is your time.
I have to lock my laptop there to protect all my secrets. So yeah, I am reading the minutes, although it's not actually me speaking, it's just a mouthpiece for Matthew Bradley, really. I have no intelligence and completely devoid of agency, much like the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Mr. Fantastic. Go ahead. Conceived that joke earlier today, so I'm glad I got it. So yeah, I would ask you want to hear some minutes, but you actually don't have a choice. The choice that Matthew offers every week is completely illusory. You have to hear some minutes. The 22nd, and this is the first time we're reading through this, so who knows what will happen. The 22nd ordinary meeting of the 170th session of the Queen's University of Belfast Literary and Scientific Society, I don't have a stamina for this, took place on the 14th of March 2019, in the year of our Lord, and was attended by around 40 members as our only debate of the year in the British parliamentary format, regretfully. The motion for the annual Dufferin competition was announced 15 minutes before the debate commenced. I wasn't there and I can't remember what it was, but I'm sure we'll find out as we In private members' business, Mr. Russell Nairn brought up the repeated rejection of Brexit deals in the House of Commons. Mr. Conor McArdle asked the House to imagine the vitriol the EU would receive should they have repeatedly refused a deal, and Mr. Morgan Hickman noted how there has been no majority for anything regarding Brexit, I mean apart from the Leave majority obviously. Aside from that, they should decide things later. Mr. Chris Hubble claimed that Parliament was simply bored as they haven't had anything to do since Iraq, and Mr. Tom McGuinness expressed his excitement for the inevitable post-Brexit Mad Max apocalypse.
Yo!
Mr. Alkin McFarlane proposed a motion of condolence to the family of the actor Pat Lappin, who played the hairy baby-making milkman Pat Mustard in Father Ted, which was passed unanimously. I'm sure he's riding Mrs. O'Reilly in the sky. In President's Questions, Mr. Matthew Sullivan, HLM, asked the President why he hates genders, asylum seekers and refugees. It says I, but because I'm sort of reading it out, I'll substitute I for he. He was going to provide context for this, but he has instead opted to leave it as is. Mr. Russell Nairn, channeling the spirit of the night's secret motion, asked the President for his biggest secret. What wickedness lies within that man's past? Hugh Dobbin has a secret. Despite his love of Colin Firth, he in fact despises the film Love Actually. Mr. Zach Scott asked the President's opinions on Alex Jones, that is the American alt-right conspiracy theorist, not the presenter of the One Show. Mr. Dobbin described the man as a specific form of nut job and expressed his enjoyment of a video of Alex Jones rants in the form of a Bon Iver. I don't know what that. A Bon Iver song. It's a folk song. Okay, there you go. Mr. Oldham McSparren noted in an incident more important to the nerves of the world than Brexit will ever be, noted the release of the new trailer for Avengers Endgame, noting how it spoiled Iron Man's escape, well, what a surprise, and the presence of Quantum Realm suits. Mr. McSparren asked the President his opinions of the United Kingdom sending arms to Saudi Arabia. After the hilarity died down, Mr. Goblin exclaimed, "I was surely sufficiently lampooned," and not much more came of that. Mr. Matthew Sullivan, HLM, that was clearly I'm from, but that also produced an Avengers-themed question, asking the President who he feels is the worst Avenger and why. Hawkeye, Mr. Goblin later began to rant about Agent Coulson, stating he adds nothing, he does nothing, and his death had zero impact, which caused Secretary-elect Ms. Chloe Ferguson to become rather irate. Mr. Matthew Bryson asked the President how disappointed he expects to be by season 8 of HBO's Game of Thrones. Mr. Dobbin predicted the series will be good, but will have an unsatisfactory ending, very much like this section of the minutes. I wonder if he's satisfied for the 90E that I pay for so we can watch it. Before the speakers left the room, the motion for the night was revealed. I'm excited to read it. Apparently, this House supports no platforming. A vote of prior opinion was taken on the motion, which read 7 ayes, 5 nays and 10 abstentions. Opening for the proposition was Mr. Chris Hubble, who expressed support for the notion that those with extremist and damaging views should not be given a chance to proliferate these ideals. Claiming platforming these individuals to be a risk to people's safety, Mr. Hubble stated that organisations have a right to choose who they do into a platform and that they should not be forced to platform individuals whose views they deem to be unacceptable and offensive. Mr. Cormac Manning opened for the opposition, stating that no platforming could silence radical views that could have positive repercussions, imploring the House to consider what would be no platform in the 1800s. Noting how prominent individuals such as Martin Luther King rose to fame through the platforms they were given, Mr. Manning stated we should trust in the spirit of debate, otherwise we may as well abolish the literific. Mr. J. Kieran spoke second for the proposition, noting the difficulties of the information age. Mr. Kieran stated that it is in the interest of organisations not to platform certain individuals in an effort to ensure that their service is one of good quality. Examining how certain controversial individuals intend to derail discussion rather than contribute to meaningful discourse, Mr. Kieran stated that no platforming is a pathway to meaningful discussion and progress. Ms. Leanne Thorpe spoke second for the opposition, noting how organisations such as news outlets have a duty to be unbiased and present views that their audience may not necessarily agree with. Noting how such organisations are often run by the wealthy, Ms. Thorpe questioned whether we want elites to become an arbiter of morality in public discussion, and noted how only hearing mainstream ideas establishes an echo chamber. I wonder how much Russia Today paid her for that one. Mr. Mark Gilmore spoke third for the proposition, noting how certain individuals have proven that they should not be given a platform. Yes, he mentioned the Nazis. He does love a wee Nazi mention there. Stating the opposition would have people take no responsibility for the consequences of their actions, Mr. Gilmore stated that by giving someone a platform, you are thereby responsible for the consequences of their words. Ms. Shannon Matt spoke third for the opposition, noting how refusal to platform organisations such as the Ku Klux Klan did not stop them from doing damage, and indeed their antagonisation furthered their cause. Presenting the action as no platforming as a form of oppression, Ms. Matt claimed that not only does no platforming harm public discourse, but furthers the cause of those who wish to express extremist views. Mr. Conor McArdle concluded for the proposition, stating the ways in which deliberately balanced discussions with those who held views contrary to facts actively harms public discussion, and that organisers should be brave enough to understand when a perspective is wrong. Claiming no platforming prevents the resurgence of archaic and harmful views, Mr. McArdle stated that there are things society agrees to be inherently wrong, and that these views should not be broadcast. Mr. Morgan Hickman concluded for the opposition, noting how QUB's invitation of the Israeli ambassador and later the Palestinian ambassador created meaningful discourse by showing both sides of the discussion. I quite enjoyed the meaningful discourse and I was protesting outside the building for that. Stating that statements made by controversial individuals such as Katie Hopkins don't directly lead to attacks but rather contribute to the dehumanisation of certain groups, Mr. Hickman stated no platform does not achieve its aims and indeed becomes a rather Orwellian concept. Questions were heard from Mr. Tom McGuinness, Mr. Matthew Bradley, HLM, Mr. Alton McSparren and Mr. Cormac Donegan. A binding vote on speaker ability was taken on the motion, which read 7 ayes, 8 nays and 8 abstentions, resulting in the motion being defeated. After much deliberation between the judges, it was decided that Ms. Shevin Matt was the winner of this year's Dufferin competition, so well done to your birthday. I assume everything in those minutes is accurate. Again, I wasn't actually there, so I don't know. I have to apologise. But can I take the minutes as read?
Aye.
Thank you very much, Mr. Glasgow, for those minutes, which were different to the minutes that one normally done, in that they were actually funny. So thank you very much for that. So it is now time for some private members' business. So if anyone's got anything they want to raise, put your hand up. Wow, the enthusiasm of the room. Yes, Mr. Colin McArdle. So any responses to Brexit? Woo! What a rush! Yes, Mr. Hubble!
Can I just plug something? 25th? No, it's not part. On the 25th, there is actually a Queen's Brexit debate. Which Mr. Conor Manning has organised with all of the parties and Queens.
So if you're interested, like Conor McIver is as well. Don't worry about it.
So if you're interested, go to that.
I'm not entirely sure like the society's like
Well, I've abused your position, so
yeah, you're always giving me abuse, Mr. Hubble, that's the thing. Yes, that's an event. It's not run by us, which is sad, but it's Conor Manning, he's a nice man, so
don't you complain.
so yeah, you can blame him. Mr. McSparrow.
Okay, actually, in all seriousness regarding Brexit, it's starting to now really resemble like a TV mini-series, okay? And then the first season when the vote happened was like, you know, like everyone was completely shocked, but by now it's a bit like Lost by the time it reaches like season 5 or something. No one cares and just wants this story to be over by now, and Brexit's sort of like that. Like, does anyone really care now? I really wish I had cricket sound effect or something. Yeah.
Does anyone really care now? Mr. McGuinness, do you care?
Yeah, like the whole like potential like irreparable damage to the economy, and you know the breakdown of the Good Friday Agreement and the imposition of a hard border, and you know the other just myriad horrible things. Like yeah, it's kind of like a bit tiring, but it's still just as horrible as it was when the vote happened. Like, I don't have no time to like, oh, you know, it's been going on for too long. It's like great, but it's still bad. Like, just because like you might be a little tired of hearing similar sounding news doesn't mean it's any less bad.
Oh, Mr. Matthew Sullivan, HLM.
You say Brexit's going to be bad, but which would you rather have? A functioning economy, peace in Northern Ireland, like good relations with the rest of the world, or blue passports?
There's a document from the HLM.
Well, there's been one unquestionably good thing about Brexit, at least that Ursula May was trending on Twitter on Monday. For those who don't know, that's the Handbook of Parliamentary Procedure. And I have a very sexily illustrated version. A book which, despite forming by default part of the uncodified British Constitution, is not available, I think, to buy for less than a few £100, and it's not digitised. But still, John Burke plugged it, so everyone likes it. And it also resulted in a lot of, you know, Theresa May and Ursula must jokes, which almost hurt some people.
See? You have to pay to look at the Constitution of the UK. Ours is online for free. Anyone can read that. Not that you want to, but like anyone can read it if you want. Anyone else on the topic of Brexit in a sad voice? Okay, are there any separate pieces of private members' business? Does anyone have an opinion on anything? Doesn't have to be topical. Oh, that was a hand, Mr. Tom McGuinness.
It's empty watching American Gods because the new season's really good, and they're releasing it weekly, which is very respectful to like people who have stuff on in March and can really only put aside a week of like, an hour a week to watch stuff. So it's very good. It's my opinion.
American Gods by Neil Gaiman. Any thoughts, Mr. Hummel?
No, but I've been watching the new series of Fleabag, and that is awesome. Very good. Highly recommend that.
Okay, does anyone know of any other television shows that are on? Anyone? Mr. McSparrow?
I mean, like, I watch Orange is the New Black, and the final season is coming out, and like, you know, how is it going to end? Because Piper's out of jail now, like, you know, how are they going to keep the story going? What is the plot here?
How are they going to keep the story going? Does anyone know any other things, Mr. Hummel?
Well, it's reoffending rates in American prisons are unrelentingly high, so I imagine she's going straight back.
White middle class.
Very long with that.
Mr. McGuinness, I'm going to keep this going until you guys are having a good time, seriously.
It's the final season, like they don't really have much more to keep it going.
No,
That's
it's
why
the
they're doing this final story.
No back and forth, please. This is very important business. We can't mess with procedure tonight, okay? You know, Okay, anyone else? There's Ashley Kane.
I don't think Piper contributed much to the storyline anyway.
Didn't contribute much to the storyline. Well, I don't know. Anyone else on something that isn't oranges is black? Anyone? Mr. Mark Gilmore.
Nazis, Colin.
Nazis.
Go for it. Now, on the topic of American prisons, something that is topical is the bail system is being reconsidered in the States. I'm not sure if anyone cares, but I've always considered the bail system over there to be super corrupt. Does anyone else think this?
Mark Gilmore didn't mention Hitler. I did not see that coming. Oh, there's actual hands up for this. This is like a good thing. Mr. Jack Patton.
I forgot his name, but the serial killer that was involved in the documentary on Netflix, which I believe. No, it didn't.
Under the Candy Parents.
Write that down, Shay. Shay, is that in the minutes?
Yep, that's it.
Is it written down?
Yep, that's okay.
Just checking. Continue, Mr. Patton.
Confessed while being interviewed that he'd been brought in by, I believe it was the police in Illinois before the murder of his first wife. He then posted bail at $500,000 and fled the state, proving that he was rich enough to get away with murder. And then compare that to reoffending rates of African American communities, of all these people who are trapped in a system where they can't afford to pay bills, so they plead guilty to go out and see their kids. It is horrendous and it needs to change.
Can I just say I feel the tone has changed dramatically, but it's very interesting. Anyone else? Anyone else on serial killers and prisons and stuff? It's like, that's like good stuff. Loads of hands went up before, but now they're all gone. Here we are. Anyone else on? Oh, yeah, put your hands up.
So it's on somewhat of a serious topic. It's not new news, but it's something that's somewhat got unreported in the UK, which was about a month ago, the Japanese Supreme Court voted on a ruling on transgender people, and they said if you want to be considered transgender, you must be sterilised. And this seems somewhat archaic. And given that Japan is generally seen as one of the first world countries outside of the West, I guess my question to the House is, should we reconsider our relationship with Japan given this sort of archaic ruling? And should we report on this? Because if this was indeed something that happened in the UK or America, there would be riots. But the fact this happened in Japan didn't even get reported.
Thoughts on that? Mr. McGinnis.
I also heard about this ruling in Japan, and it's incredibly troubling. The idea that any minority group can be, that has to be sterilised is just objectively nightmarish. It's genuinely this is fascist, Naziist behaviour. But the thing is, I wish I could share your confidence that if such a measure was introduced in here in America, that it would be met with the same level of mass protests. I mean, that exact policy was advocated in The Economist recently, and they've not seen any massive blowback to that. They've apologised for it. That was published, and there is a increasing trend of anti-trans rhetoric in the British press that is frankly disgusting, and there isn't really much effort on a governmental level to discourage it, and there needs to be, because frankly, these people who are living incredibly difficult lives, who are discriminated against in their workplace, and their back from their families, those people who need all the help they can get, and at the moment they are being treated like the absolute right society. It needs to stop it, frankly.
Well, that's the issue. Mr. Hummel.
I think. Whilst it is archaic, I think we have a lot of relationships with countries that are archaic and have a lot of archaic views or archaic policies, and we don't really care because they're quite rich or because they can provide us with some form of, not to get too much socialist before the debate, but they have capital, they have businesses that we can thrive on. So we don't really care how they treat minorities, we don't really care how they treat the poor people, because we can sell them weapons and they can give us money, or they can the end of the day, until that changes, until we start prioritising like the financial aspect of it, then we probably won't care as a country about LGBT people suffering in Japan or in any other of these countries that we have horrible relationships with.
Mr. Expand.
Yeah, this is actually probably an important point. It just needs to be made. You see this consistently with the Western powers. I think America, I'll take time for this, used to say, he may be a bastard, but he's our bastard. This seems to be actually a recurrent theme throughout US and UK political history. So I think, in all fairness, we really shouldn't be surprised. There was no mass media attempt to criticise this because ultimately Japan is an ally of the West in the South China Sea, one of the most strategically important regions in the world. So it's really gonna happen. There was no time to blind eye to it.
Was that was an accurate quotation, right?
Yeah.
I believe if anyone is willing to correct me, I believe that means that you won't be fined for the swear.
I reckon he said a naughty word and he owes me a bottle of wine. So recompense me for the offence that I took and I took
Well, tell you what, it'll be decided by whether Shane writes it in his notes.
I've already written the word fine in all caps.
Is it bold as well?
It is now.
Put it bold. Always fines and bold. Oh yes, that is so true. Sweet fonts. Anyone else? Are there any other pieces of private members' business at all? None? Okay, so now we will move on to President's Questions. This is when you can ask, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. You can ask me questions about the society, about my life, about my mental health, whatever floats your boat, Mr. Sullivan.
Mr. President.
Yes.
If you could be any pseudo-socialist dictatorship, which pseudo-socialist dictatorship would you be?
I would have to answer that by saying I would just create my own. See? Yes. Bangor Council. That's the answer. Okay. Mr. Russell there.
So, the motion we have before us tonight asks us all the question whether or not we think Cuba has been a success. That's why, in these questions, I would like to ask you, if you could be any success, which success would you be? And why?
Oh, I was really dreaded that you'd ask me about Cuba because I'm actually really looking forward to tonight's debate because I know absolutely nothing about it. So I'm looking forward to being educated. If I could be any success, what would I be? What's made a lot of money? Marvel Cinematic Universe? I'd take that. That was a success. I can't think of many successful things. I don't actually know what that says about my life, but you know, there we are. That's pardon. Are brown plates a success?
Well, consider it, I mean, are they a failure? Is the question.
If you really want to be regular, like they're fairly.
The thing with brown flakes is they're like cornflakes that have gone through a midlife crisis, and I just feel sorry for them in that regard.
Or are cornflakes, brown flakes gone through a midlife crisis?
Brown flakes are just strictly inferior fruit and fibre.
It's really worrying when the most passionate debate we've had all evening is about the nature of a brown flake. Yes, Mr. Black HLM, take me out of this hellhole, or take me into a new one, whichever.
Thank you very much, Mr. President-elect, or Secretary, or whatever you are this evening. If I may ask two questions, one's very quick and factual, and the other one's more personal to you. So, quick factual one is, what awards is or are the Society up for this evening? And then the other one is, what was your personal highlight from last night's conference this evening?
Okay, so the Society is up for Best Society. And even if we don't win it there, that's false because we just objectively are. Like, look around. And what was my personal highlight from the Conversazione? I was throughout the Conversazione. I don't drink, so like this wasn't affected by anything. But I was just in a pure state of elation, just the entire evening. I was like, this is great. And honestly, for me, this is going to sound really sad, but it was when I was standing, you know, when we were in time afterwards. And you know the way they've got all these raised bits? And I just looked out and there was just the entire literature effect there having a really good time and I was like, yeah, that's That's what we're meant to do. So that's my highlight. Seeing everyone else have a really good time. That was a very homophobic comment, Miss Ferguson. None of that. Mr. McGuinness.
I know you're not officially the chairman. You're just serving you're filling in.
He's the chairman. He's just not president.
President. You're not president yet. But allow me to have the singular honour of being the first to ask you, what did you have for your breakfast this morning?
Oh, shame.
Your food are nourishment to me.
So, one minute, that is the funniest joke that's ever been made in this society.
I actually put out that everybody laughed and then clapped.
So what I had for my breakfast this morning, I actually haven't eaten much today. I've got half of my breakfast still here, so because you've asked that question, I'm just going to eat it.
Okay, thank God you're pointing towards your I really thought you were pointing towards your stomach, and I was like, that's more knowledge about your digestive habits than I need.
No, people don't want knowledge about my digestive habits, but it's one of these. It's called a Twix top. Is anyone familiar with this?
No.
If you imagine a Twix, and then imagine it being run over by a van, that's pretty much what a Twix top is, and it has melted in my pocket, so it's... Oh, that's disgusting. I'll still eat it though. But like, it's got chocolate on the top and it melts and it's going all over my hands and it's really upsetting me, so I'm just going to eat this bit. Yeah, now my hands are covered in chocolate. What a dignified way to go. Any more questions? Yes?
Are you prefer a left Twix or a right Twix? Depends on your home. Like I don't happen to have two left Twixes in it and it didn't taste nice.
The left Twix or the right Twix? That is the question. I would have to say...
I like those two left Twix perfect.
Yeah, but the sad thing about this is it's not really a Twix because there's only one of them, which is why I always pack myself two. But I'm going to say like half and half, stick it back together, Franken Twix, done.
That's a very president answer.
It is. That's worrying. Any other questions? Mr. Gilmore.
Mr. President, there was a debate that came up last night, it's one that's haunted me since. Say something terrible was to happen to you next year. Yes. With the interim president in that circumstance.
Right, so this requires context. So, right, this requires...
Whose house did you sleep at last night? Whose house was it?
That's a bit of a scandal. That seems like invested interest.
Okay, this requires a bit of context. So, in the summer of 2017, I was president of the society for 3 months because the SU may have invalidated someone's election, right? So I was like a kind of meme for 3 months because I just there had to be someone to fill the position. And so everyone's kind of hoping that my election's invalidated because I'm also doing an MA. And so there was quite an argument last night about who would be my temporary replacement. And these two were very, very quick to put their names forward. Very, very quick. So, I'm going to have to choose now. I'm going to choose Mark Gilmore. Because you give us... Yeah. What?
What? We're happy for you.
Yeah, I'm not. You know what? You know what? If my election is invalidated, I'm going to say this now. It will be given to Mark Gilmore. That's the final thing, because I know it will be invalidated, so that's fun. Like, minute that, I'm putting it in highlighted, please, just because I know that'll come back to haunt me. So yes, just because you never suspected it, it's you. So, there we go. Anyone else? I don't want this to drag on for too long, so final question, Mr. Black.
Thank you, Mr. President, we were speaking earlier via afternoon, and you sent me a picture of a woman clothing that you're wearing. I thought it's very nice. I'd like to ask, are you wearing an eye, and if so, would you like to share that with us?
Right, I do not appreciate the word of that. That made it sound like I was wearing like a terrific branded thong or something, which is just disgusting. Getting that image into people's heads, it would look like a pink blancmange that had been rolled along the floor of a barber's. That's the image that you're putting into people's heads. But no, it was in fact. How do I... See, the thing is, I'm only 5'6", so I can't really show it off, but these trousers that match the coat, I wore this... Pardon? This is feeling... I'm feeling oddly abused at the moment. But yes, the trousers match the coat. It's like.
Give us a twirl.
That's clothes. I wear clothes occasionally, mostly for society. Yeah, are there any other President's questions? Just one, if it's very quick.
Mr. President, the Constitution states that members of the executive must wear their gowns during their time in the session. Why aren't you wearing your gown?
You know full well why I wasn't wearing my gown.
Is it acceptable for the President to take off his gown in the chamber, sir?
That's making it sound like I just stripped naked in front of the entire room, which is not what happened for the sake of purpose.
Write that down, shit. That is
I mean, it's happened before.
It was off for but a matter of minutes or seconds, or I'm just going to sit down. But before I do, it's time for the vote of prior opinion. So, tonight's motion, you don't need a membership card for this. The motion is, this House believes Cuba has been a success. All those in favour of the motion, please raise your hands and say aye. Raise them really high because I'm really short. 1, 2, 6.
Great counter.
Now, all those against the motion, please raise your hands and say nay.
Mark, where's the
No kind of.
And all of those who have no opinion, don't want to have an opinion, or simply like saying meh, please raise your hand to abstain and say meh.
One minute.
Oh, Mr. Treasuretary, that's a word. Can you please read back that vote?
So there were 6 ayes, there were 9 nays, which actually spells out 69 in the wee panel. And lots of alliance voters in tonight, 8 abstentions.
Yeah.
So the nays have it at the minute.
The nays have it.
The nays have it, so they do. Yeah.
Nobody can clap at this bit, so let's clap. You have done nothing so far, but we're clapping you anyway. So, it's debate time. So there is a thing, what was it you wanted me to announce? I completely forgot.
Right, Neil.
Oh yes, one of our speakers has unfortunately dropped out due to personal circumstances. So so the first speaker for one of the sites has changed. So the order of speakers is a bit different.
It's actually changed quite significantly. It's now first, second, third.
Okay, so the speaker order has changed rather significantly, just to let you all know. So,
And Russell has stepped in on 15 minutes notice.
and Mr. Russell then has stepped in on 15 minutes notice. So, to propose the motion, first, I would like to welcome up Mr. Chris Hubble.
Are there any fluent Spanish speakers in?
Yes.
Well, I apologise for this. Here we go. Estamos en un momento decisivo de nuestra historia. La tiranía ha sido derrotada. La alegría es inmensa. Y sin embargo, queda mucho por hacer todavía. No nos engañamos creyendo que en lo adelante todo será fácil. Cuidado, en lo adelante todo será más difícil. We are at a decisive moment in history. Tyranny has been defeated. The happiness is immense. However, there is still much to be done. Let's not deceive ourselves in believing that from now on everything will be easy. Perhaps everything from now on, things will be more difficult. This year marks the 60th anniversary of the end of the Cuban Revolution, the defeat of the US-backed authoritarian dictator Fulgencio Batista, guerrilla forces led by Fidel Castro, his brother Raul, and the now iconic revolutionary Che Guevara. Looking back, the words of Fidel Castro seem entirely apt. The last 6 years of Cuban history have not been easy, and the legacy of that revolution is highly contested. As one of the only unashamedly socialist countries with a one-party system and a planned economy, Cuba is the last bastion of resistance to the world of capitalism and Western imperialism. On the one hand, Cuba has seen vast improvements in education, healthcare, living standards and opportunity. On the other, there have been human rights abuses, mistreatment of LGBTQ people, and harsh prison treatment. But we put forward this notion that Cuba has been a success because despite an inhumane embargo by the richest power in the world, despite the collapse of the USSR and the support they gave to alleviate food shortages and other resources, Cuba has proven itself to be a beacon of hope in an increasingly darkened world. An example to us all of what a genuine care for humanity can achieve. Let me be clear, success is not GDP. Success is not the freedom to buy McDonald's or the latest iPhone. In other words, success is not capital. Success for us is to have opportunities to choose a career regardless of your birth. It is to have access to healthcare and education regardless of your birth. It is to have a quality of life, not a quantity of cash. It is to be compassionate, international in outlook, to stay true to the morals of the revolution for which several men and women lost their lives in the pursuit of. Mr. Sullivan will go on to talk about some of the many successes Cuba has witnessed in the domestic plane. But to begin with, I'd like to talk about Cuba's record in the international realm. Fidel Castro was described by fellow revolutionary and freedom fighter Nelson Mandela as a source of inspiration to freedom-loving people around the world. Under his leadership, this country of 11 million people, with, as I'm sure the opposition will not hesitate to remind you, poor finances and poor resources, has to date sent over 380,000 soldiers and officers to support resistance struggles and independence movements in Africa alone. Not for oil or personal gain, not for resources or ideological battles, but out of a genuine belief in internationalism and in freedom for the world's peoples. Often going against the advice of their greatest ally, the USSR, Cuba dedicated itself to supporting the people of that continent as they shook loose the chains of oppression, as they broke free from the heavy shackles of white minority governments and colonial rule.
So what you're saying here is they're sending military efforts actively to assist against governments in other countries. And yet at the same time, for ideological purposes, at the same time you claim that this is an injustice when done by someone like America or whatnot. Surely this is a comparable instance of bad.
No, I wouldn't say that. And I also didn't say that the... so examples of the USA in terms of like Grenada, it was democratically elected governments that would be overthrown. The governments in Africa were imperial governments, such as in Angola, which was a Portuguese colony up until 79, South Africa, which was white minority rule, Algiers, which was French rule. I'll get into that in this one. So it was Cuban military support that helped to attain Algiers' independence from France. It was the Cuban victory of South Africa's proxy war in Angola that was the first defeat of the South African army, that paved the way for both Angola's independence from Portugal and the fall of the apartheid regime in South Africa. And this legacy of support has continued to today. When the Ebola crisis struck West Africa, it was Cuban medics who were at the forefront of supporting African countries in tackling it, providing more medical support than any other nation. Cuban universities also hold places for African students to come and study at no expense to themselves. Again, these efforts are not for the benefit of Cuba or the Cuban people, but show an expressed desire to help other nations to build up from the ruins of empire. Cuba is one of the most prolific providers of international aid, despite its limited financial resources. And again, this is a country of 11 million people. It is a small nation. Nelson Mandela said of Cuba during his time on Robben Island that it was the first time that a country had come from another continent not to take something away, but to help Africans to achieve their freedom. For a continent which had suffered so heavily at the hands of Western powers and had been plagued and is still plagued by the ravages of unrelenting capital, Cuba's unadulterated, unconditional support is noted by the deep sense of loss felt by the people of that continent on the death of Fidel Castro. In the words of one, if Africa was a country, he would be one of our national heroes. And it's not just in Africa. Cuban troops fought against the United States invasion of Grenada, supporting the democratically elected leftist government against an imperialist attack. For Latin America, the Cuban people have provided them with undying solidarity and a compassion unmatched by any of the Western powers. We can talk of the failures of socialism, but where is the success of capitalism in Africa, Asia, or Latin America? Cuba have continued to live by the values of internationalism and socialism with which they fought the revolution. They have been resoundingly successful in their solidarity and support for the countries often ignored by the powers that be, both in the West and the Soviet bloc when it was there. To paraphrase Castro himself, you can condemn Cuba, it does not matter. History will absolve them. I beg you to propose this motion.
And I'd now like to welcome in his first speech to society to open for the opposition, Mr. Ashley Dolan.
The proposition raised some very good points, and I struggle to argue with the carelessness Cuba does have in giving aid, but he is wrong in some points where he says it's without reward. He had given aid with the Venezuela in the past for oil. This is a country that's 80% imports. It needs it from somewhere in the world. It's not simply that simple. In fact, the healthcare industry is one of the most, it brings in a lot of money for them, more so than tourism. It brings in more money, more so than tourism in general. It is literally a private industry in itself. I know it's ironic to say that, but it is. The healthcare is two different standards. There's one for citizens, and there's one for foreigners, and there's one for the elites of that society. When you go to the medical care, it lacks so many resources. Basic things like aspirin, and all this is reserved for, like I said, the performance. I would also bring a point that is just blatantly ignored. That I would argue that success should be the quality of life of an individual, personal liberty, and given to a country which Cuba simply denies. In Cuba, between months of January and August of 2018, there have been 2,000 arbitrary arrests for people for doing simple things. One woman was arrested because she burnt the modern constitution, 2019 constitution. But I'd also like to bring up a point in itself.
On that point,
yes.
If you go to the United States of America and if you burn a US flag, you can be arrested. How is that in any way?
Well, I believe that was
in Cuba.
Well, hold on, that was changed. I know that was the case. I remember Bill Hicks made a point about that. That's been changed as of recently. And on top of that, just because they do it there doesn't mean it's okay for Cuba. I disagree with it on both counts. I will rally against free speech issues in this country, and I'll rally against it in Cuba. The burned constitution, the modern constitution, I might add, is willing to make the market freer, which oddly enough was Castro's original mission statement, as he wanted a freer economy to begin with. When coming to a point, he said, the doors are open to private investment that contribute to industrial development of Cuba. But unfortunately, I suppose, power corrupts a man. He turned it into an afford. Yes.
That's because initially Castro was not a socialist. The Cuban Revolution was socialist, and the majority of the people who fought Castro was not the revolution, despite certain slogans. And actually, the Cuban people did not have that revolution to just replace it with a free market, despite Castro's.
But the intention was there under his leadership, and that completely changed when he was leader. Can't deny that. So you go to all these quality of life issues, like you're talking about what I mentioned about human rights, arbitrary detentions of people, of political prisoners that are only known. Like there's 120 current political prisoners at this current moment, but there could be plenty more because no human rights organisations are in the prison at the moment. You can't simply argue the country's success when ignoring so many, like a laundry list of issues provided by human rights organisations. All of this because you question the status quo, you question the government. You then have to, and despite what you say, I don't agree with your term that the economy is not a big factor. I understand, okay, GDP is not everything, and certainly there is more to life than money. But there's also, you have to consider, life has to be comfortable for the people there. And life isn't comfortable when you're surviving on $40 a month, when a basic internet package that's only been recently given to the people, 40 gigabytes a month for $30, and they're given $40 a month. Like, how can you survive with that? No offense. The internet's great. Yeah, sure.
Because I'm actually correct. It's $19. It's less than.
It's $19 for megabytes.
No, $19 in terms of people's income on average per month, which is very low. But food is paid for, healthcare is paid for, travel is incredibly low. They have one of the highest happiness rates in the world. So yeah.
You say travel is great, but hold on a second. Travel within the country is illegal. Like a citizen from the outskirts can't move to Havana without permission from the government, which, by the way, is a denial of human rights in of itself. And that's what information I've got for you. But maybe that's wrong. I'll see that point. Maybe I don't know.
Yeah,
maybe my children don't. Incorrect?
No, income, not the internet.
Oh, the income.
Back and forth place.
Oh, fair. Well, even then, that still doesn't address the fact that for internet for 1 month is $30, and that's only for perspective. This doesn't, like, when you go to Cuba, houses are poorly maintained because a bucket of paint costs more than someone's monthly wage. You can't simply keep up with this. And you can say, oh, I blame the US, but at the same time, a part of the game of world economics is simply having to curb your issues to try and suit the rest of the world. This is what the EU is. This is what a lot of trading blocks are. Sorry. I also want to point out that compared to other, you talked about, like, well, where is capitalism for Africa? Well, Botswana is a perfect example of where capitalism has been success, isn't it? You also have to point out the fact that other Caribbean countries do so much better than Cuba, and Cuba should have no excuse. It is the largest in size and largest in population, yet it only ranks 15 out of GDP for out of 22 Caribbean countries, with Bahamas doing considerably better despite having lower landmass, lower population. The average wage there is like $5,000 a month. That's the average. You can't really argue with the numbers, and this is about people having comfortable lives, being able to buy things, like say, I'll bring up again the internet, buying things food. You talk about how things are subsidized, but the food supplies they give them are completely meager, and obviously this comes down to issues of imports.
On that point.
Can I take the bonus right now?
It was like just before I had it.
Oh, fair enough. I'll wrap up then.
You can't take it if you want, please, just before I had it.
No, I finished my points. To wrap up, I think you're blatantly ignoring the quality of life, people's personal liberty in this country. The idea that you have a sense opinion against the government is a right that should be given to people, and a right that's not been given to Cuban citizens. The fact that Cuba seems to put the health and well-being of foreigners in other countries ahead of its own citizens, which in my opinion is not a successful country. There's nothing wrong with being good to your citizens and as well as being good to the other world. I don't think Cuba is successful in that regard. So that's kind of really my point.
We have another round of applause for his maiden speech. I now have the great pleasure of welcoming Mr. Matthew Sullivan to speak second for the proposition.
Look, imagine you're Ireland, and the entire EU is a massive superstate, and also they're fascist and they hate your ideology because you love freedom and they love whatever it is the bureaucrats want. Occasionally, the EU just sort of sends people over to invade your country, you fight them back, you make some allies with America, you have a massive crisis that nearly causes World War III. The EU embargoes you, so your economy kind of tanks, and yet you survive. Because, you know, Ireland's the plucky underdog here, you're doing alright, despite the fact you have a giant hostile neighbour doing everything it can to ruin you. That's Cuba. Cuba is tiny and weak compared to its biggest neighbour, North America, I meant the USA. The USA is massive, and it does not like Cuba. It does not. It does basically everything it can to ruin it. it embargoes them. It occasionally invades them. It forces Cuba to make allies with the Soviet Union of all places. But I'm not here to talk about Cuba's international position. I'm here to talk about how they succeed incredibly, given their position in their domestic policy, despite what other countries have done to try and bring them down. Cuba has the best doctors in the world. It also has the most doctors per capita of any country in the world. Yes, its healthcare system suffers because it has a massive lack of medical supplies. Can you guess why they have a lack of medical supplies in the country? It's because no one's allowed to sell them medical supplies. Despite that, they've done a good job of making do with what they have. They created that lung cancer vaccine, which is available across the world. It's also free to all Cubans, which is another good point. It's got universal health care, which is more than most countries in the world can say. If you're sick in Cuba, you're going to get treated. Which brings me on to some rebuttal. The first speaker of the proposition talked about how Cuba's 15th in GDP in North America. That's true, but when you have an embargo in your country, that's going to happen. On the upside, it's 8th in Human Development Index. In fact, Cuba, for a developing country, has a really high Human Development Index. It's 0.78, which is higher than Mexico, Brazil, China, South Africa, or India. And again, 8th in North America. The first question is how Cubans can get comfortable in their meager salaries. And while it's true that Cuban salaries are very, very low, everybody gets food. Everybody gets education. Everybody gets health care. Sure, Cuban houses might be poorly maintained, but everybody has a house.
That point.
Sure.
You have all these things as long as you don't speak out against the government. Sure. The second you start speaking out or thinking against what the government wants you to think, then you lose all those rights and you end up massively mistreated.
Yeah, it's true. Cuba has some corruption. But overall, I'd say quality of life is pretty good, and it compares quite favourably to a lot of developed countries. And it ranks consistently highest for a lot of metrics in the developing world. Since the revolution, free education has been spread across the country, from the richest in the cities to the poorest in the countryside. Literacy rates increased from 40% to 99.8%, which is pretty damn good for a developing country, and is in fact the highest of any developed country. Going back to health, it was the first country in the world to end mother-to-child transmission of HIV and syphilis. It is one of the lowest infant mortality rates of any developing country. And I just ran out of content. I'll take any POIs. Yes.
Yeah, so you repeatedly bring up the sort of embargo, but like the embargo took place because Cuba nationalized, bringing us billions of like US investments in the country. Isn't that a sign of an unsuccessful country that would nationalize the investments of their biggest trading partner and the biggest economy in the entire world? How is that a successful thing to do?
Isn't it a sign of an unsuccessful country which allows foreign capitalist imperialists to just buy up all of their land? If you're a tiny poor country beside a gigantic economic superpower who wants to buy you out, you're not going to let them buy you out, which is why, while they have foreign investment now, it's restricted to 49%, so companies in America can't just buy out Cuban companies. Yeah, sure.
So basically going back to like equality rights thing, and you kind of like scathed over, I thought, Russell's introduction of that. I suppose Cuba's general like attitude to human rights, because all those things are great with the quality of life, but isn't that all like ridiculously undermined? If they're not like, if it's not access to everyone, and if they're not supporting human rights frameworks, surely that's like.
Look, people like to talk about the human rights abuses that the Cuban government inflicts upon its people. But Cubans have the right to life. They have the right to have food. They have the right to shelter. These are rights developed countries don't provide. This is a country which commits human rights abuses. We abuse the human rights of every man, woman, and child on the street. Every man, woman, and child who has to visit a food bank. Sure, Cuba might send some political prisoners off to black sites, But if America does that, and America at least doesn't pay for their healthcare. America will give you a house, America will give you food, but when it comes down to it, if you insult the American government, they'll probably send you to Guantanamo Bay anyway. Thank you.
Well, cheery end to that speech. Now, I am pleasure welcoming Mr. Russell Laird to speak second for the opposition.
Okay, so the crux of what I'm going to be talking about here is why dictatorships are bad and why Cuba is an example of one of the worst amongst them. I've got three main points that I'm going to be bringing in regards to this. I've got points regarding the quality of life, I've got points regarding the access into information, and I've got a third point regarding the inefficiency of totalitarian states. First, though, I've got a bit of rebuttal. First of all, we have this point from Matthew Sullivan about how Cuba has the most doctors in the world and all this great thing about medicine. He, of course, forgets to mention that many, many Cuban doctors are actively getting driven away from the country because Cuba is not paying them enough. They are emigrating. There is mass emigration of Cuban doctors. We have another thing. You refer to the idea of Cuba acting against its own people as corruption. That's not corruption. That is institutionalized. The entirety of the Cuban state is institutionalized evil and oppression of its own people. Another note on this lung cancer cure. It's been shown to work as a treatment, but we haven't actually had any proper testing on it and needs to be more, so we can't really take that as a point. So, we define success very differently to what the proposition is talking about success in regards to this. They're basically saying that success, as long as the country still technically exists and scrapes by its current government system. We're talking about success in regards to human kindness, freedom to be yourself, and the ability to live the best possible life you can. No thank you. They have a lot of time. Chris talks about this a lot. He talks about how, it's so great because the people of Cuba are so free. They have all this time on their hands, but they do not have the functional money or resources to actually carry out and actually fulfill themselves to their max potential. So, quality of life tied to the lack of expression in Cuba. Cuba exists in a state of massive disparity. The disparity between the rural and the urban. A massive, obscene disparity that exists. You see Cuba, and it's constantly depicted, and this is the thing you see with totalitarian states all over the world, where they depict, when they're advertising themselves, they depict their urban regions. They depict this built-up image of tequila and cigars and this really lavish world where everything's great. Don't you want to come to communist Cuba? It's so fantastic. And then you look outside of that. You lift away, the Wizard of Oz's curtain, and you see the truth behind that, and you see the poverty. The abject poverty of rural Cuba. Go ahead.
That's just fundamentally not true. The revolution was founded in the suburban, in the countryside, and it was brought into the cities, and it was those regions that benefited more than the cities from this regime. It was them who were massively ignored by the old regime in terms of education and health.
That does not change the fact that people in rural Cuba live in abject poverty. There is no denying that. It is mass poverty outside of the cities. Once you get outside of the cities, you are living in a state of poverty. And here's the thing, with being in the cities, this points out to the fact you see across communist regimes, across totalitarian regimes, your ability to live a high-quality life is directly tied to unquestioning loyalty to the government. Unquestioning loyalty and the fact that you are not going to question whatever is put before you. If you question this, yeah, sure, you can have this free healthcare, you can have this free education, you can have this high literacy rate. You have these high literacy rates. The problem is, with all this literacy, you're not allowed to read things that help you question. You're not allowed to read 1984, which is high literacy rate. You're not allowed to read anti-government material. You're only allowed to use that literacy to read what the government says you can read. Which brings me on to my next point regarding access to information. Cuba very frequently ranks amongst the lowest, the worst countries for press freedom in the world. Any publication in Cuba, anything you want to put out, has to be approved by a government agency to prevent the proliferation of ideals such as freedom, independence, good crack. All of those things are strictly regulated and cracked down on by the Cuban government to prevent people from getting notions. You want to stop people from getting notions because if they get notions, they might realize that they can actually throw you out and live better lives. An example of this is regard to computers and the internet. There's a discussion about the internet, and I'm bringing an expansion upon that. It only became legal for private citizens to purchase computers in 2007. Wi-Fi only became legal for private citizens about 2 or 3 months ago, very, very recently. We've seen this continuous holding back of technology and freedom of information from the people in Cuba in order to maintain its monopoly on control. And they only allow this kind of thing to be put before the people when they are sure they have it nailed down and they can absolutely control all access people have. How are they controlling all the access people have? Well, in regards to the internet, all internet traffic in Cuba is filtered through a proxy server. So whenever you log on to the internet in Cuba, the government sees your username, it sees your password, it sees all of your access. Yes, people see all your access here, but privacy is literally impossible in Cuba. Privacy is difficult for us in the West. It is literally impossible because the government has all your usernames, passwords, all of your data in that regard.
On that point, not so okay. I used to about 2 or 3 months ago. Here is an Instagram post I made in Cuba and shared from Cuba 2 years ago. As well as that, there you're saying about privacy. Cuba's just more open about it in the West. Is they're doing the exact same thing. They're just admitting, yeah, we look at your stuff, we know what happens to
No, the government does not have your usernames and passwords. The government, you are allowed to use encryption in Western countries. The government does not directly have your password. It's in fact impossible for the government to get your passwords if they're hashed directly. That's nonsensical. More to the point, I'll be willing to accept the correction about the Wi-Fi point. It's all very recently acquired information given the short time, but that was the correction I was. Yes, so this entire privacy is literally impossible, and this government and it's all keeping access to information and controlling it very seriously. Final point. The inefficiency of dictatorships and why this is really bad. So, no thank you. Concentrated power allows inefficient use of resources. Let's talk about Castro, alright? Castro, the man himself, he spent obscene amounts of state money on an ice cream complex. Literally converting a city block into a big ice cream complex because he loved cows so much. Let me tell you how much Castro loved cows. Alright? Castro, this is very serious. Cuban cows are bad at producing milk, so Castro imported a massive load of Canadian cows and then built a massive climate-controlled complex for them, but they still weren't producing enough milk, so he hired a bunch of scientists to crossbreed this super cow. And when I say super cow, I don't mean mass amount of super cow that he could export, I mean singular cow. Its name was like El Ubre Blanco, which translates to the white udder. This cow could produce 110 liters of milk per day. It was a juicy boy. Can I have 1 more minute to finish this?
I think that needs to go to a vote. All in favor of giving him 1 more minute to It's juicy boy time.
Okay, and the best thing about the juicy boy, alright? There were daily reports in the newspaper about how the juicy boy was doing. And when juicy boy eventually died, Castro had a statue built in his honor. What does this say? This talks about how inefficient dictators use resources and how it allows for societies to go completely off the rail and misuse state funds. Because in a dictatorship, we have the problem of successors. So, Castro wasn't great in my opinion, but even if you argue that he was good, in a dictatorship you have no actual mechanism for proper succession. Even if you have a good dictator, time is not static and eventually someone bad will come in. An example of this, we had Lenin, who many people will proclaim as a wonderful progressive communist, and of course he dies, Stalin's in charge. There's no mechanism for proper succession. So, I've summed everything up. Why is Cuba bad? Poor quality of life, not a success in that regard. No access to information, not a success in that regard. Dictators are inefficient, not a success for that. Chris, I have some Spanish for you. Cuba es bolas, Cuba is balls. Thank you.
Wow. Well, I never did. It now gives me great pleasure to welcome, to conclude the proposition, Mr. Alderman Sparrow.
Well, comrades, I am very much prepared for the large amount of POIs I am about to get right now. So, I just want to actually make a couple of points, first of all, of rebuttal to the other side. So, First, we are not presenting this sort of socialist utopia, sort of Gene Roddenberry-esque image of what Cuba is. We don't think it's some sort of like, paradise, okay? However, as a successful nation, it quite clearly is a successful nation in the fact that people are fed, they've got medical supplies, they do have access to the internet, which I'm going to go into a lot more detail on later, Russell, because I've used it. And as well as that there, it's overall a decent place. But I want to say, first of all, I actually think your thing with this cow is a complete disgrace that you're having a go at the big Juicy, was its name?
No, it was
we passed a commiseration to a dog that was mayor, okay? So is it okay for Americans to have dogs that are mayors, but one super cow is apparently illegitimate? Like, I think a super cow is far more impressive than a dog that was mayor. Dictatorship. Thank you. Yes, so, anyway, getting on to the actual point of my argument. First of all, this man here, whose name I'm very sorry, I have forgotten, was talking about the starving population. Ashley, nice to meet you. About the starving population in Cuba and saying that the population is starving and they cannot eat and they cannot buy food. And the actual is not true. They do have ration books. However, that is the amount of food that every citizen, regardless if they're unemployed, regardless if they're rich or if they're poor, gets no matter what. I will take it in a minute, so I will. And any other food they buy is simply surplus. So you have your basic needs provided for you. Now, I don't know about you, but the homeless people around here rely on drunken idiots to go to McDonald's at 1 o'clock in the morning and buy them a burger to eat. In Cuba, they've actually got a source of food given to them by the government. So I think to say that the country isn't successful and isn't humanitarian is a disgrace. Yes?
I believe I said that the rations were pretty meagre or basic.
Yes, I can actually tell you what the rations were. You get rice, chicken, bread, potatoes every single week. You get a surplus supply of them, and it is enough to keep a human being going. Admittedly, you're probably not going to go and get fat with it. You're going to be lean and in good shape. However, you will survive with a bare minimum. So I think that's a pretty decent thing for any government to do, and one our Western nations should take into consideration. Now, we're talking about human rights abuses in Cuba. I'm not going to lie. The Cubans have not been perfect on the human rights abuses, okay? There are definitely a few flaws. However, the United States of America, their biggest critic, literally owns an illegal torture dungeon on Cuba, where they literally bring people in and rough them up. Yes?
This seems a bit one boundary, doesn't it? Saying, we can excuse the bad things Cuba does because these other people also do bad things. It doesn't change the norm.
Okay, well, so I'll ask this. So we're not actually talking, is Cuba a bad or a good place? We're asking, is it successful? Now, would you consider the United States a successful country?
That's no back and forth.
What? No, fair enough. Okay, what I'm saying is here is that Cuba is a successful country for the vast bulk of its population. You go to any country, there are going to be dissenters, and there are going to be bits of the government that do not want to tolerate them. We see it in the UK all the time. And for Christ's sake, we live in Northern Ireland, so we all know about dissenters and the government not getting on with them. As well as that there, people go on about the quality of housing in Cuba. Well, I've got news, 98% of Cubans own their own house. They have their own house that they own. The UK cannot in any way say that it has a level of housing ownership as high as Cuba does. It is far higher it's far higher in Cuba. Education is superior. Per head of population, almost 5 times as many people have a PhD in Cuba as opposed to any Western nation. Now, if you look at another example of a very similar nation to Cuba who went up against the USA, how many people in here would, in all honesty, criticise Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam for his struggle for independence? No one. So, no one would criticise it. However, the situations virtually parallel each other. The reason we still hear about Ho Chi, we don't hear about Ho Chi Minh anymore, is because they have since made up with the US. Cuba was on the US's doorstep. It was equivalent to Britain trying to annoy the EU or something like that. They're not going to forgive them anytime soon for that mistake. They're going to be like, no, you went against us and you interfered with our money. The US sugar industry is our third biggest industry. Castro nationalised sugar and Cuba has never been forgiven for it since he took an asset and he made it the property of the people again. But in doing so, he annoyed an awful lot of US bankers in the process. Cuba, ultimately, I am not going to say, has been a complete success, okay? It has its problems. However, as a functioning nation, it operates very well. People have got basic necessities provided for them. It is stood up in the hands of an oppressor who will not let it survive. As well as that, it is also now providing aid to other countries. Hurricane Harvey, something the US struggled with. Cuba sent doctors and relief out to other countries to help them in the process. I, like my colleague Mr. Sullivan, have ran out of points to make, so if anyone got a POI to give me. Yes?
Well, I just illustrate the arguments why I didn't have points.
What is it?
The back and forth, please.
Well, does that illustrate the fact that Cuba hasn't been successful? You've ran out of points to make it clear that it has.
No, it illustrates that I did not have much time to write this speech today. I've sort of been making this up in the cuff. However, I think we've got to look at Cuba in a serious light of it has been providing for its people, and that the reason that we see it as an unsuccessful country is because the Western media continually pushes at us that it is an unsuccessful country, whenever in actuality people are happy, they're provided for, they have medicine, food, and virtually everything else they could ask for. Yes?
But people can't say if they're not happy with the government. I can say, oh, they're happy, but if they ever were to say any dissenting opinion about the government, it's prisons.
I take what you're saying on board, however, I want to ask you this here. If you were to go to the UK and if you were to start to seriously question the government, what they've done is they've just created a culture where anyone who says anything which is dissenting is viewed as stupid, uncool, they're not taken seriously, their views are just, they're allowed to scream, but no one's going to listen. Cuba is honestly more open about the fact that they just suppress these views, unlike, let's be honest, the Western nations all do it as well. So, it's just a matter of both are corrupt, one's more honest about it.
Thank you very much for this inspiring speech. I'd now like to welcome up Mr. Joseph Thurman.
One moment.
Take your time. That sounds sarcastic, but actually, do take your time.
It's okay, you're still protecting time.
Yes.
And everyone's listening in. Nothing's happening, don't worry.
I'm not afraid, which I could not.
Okay, I shall begin. Hello everyone, I'm here to whip the case for the opposition. Now, this is a somewhat substantive debate, you could say. Throughout the sort of proposition speech, I've sort of noticed maybe two key points of clash. There was maybe on the issues of healthcare and resources and the fact that the government acquisitions of resources to them, and therefore it can be clarified as a success. That is one point. And the second point was sort of the mention of the embargo, saying, well, despite this embargo unfairly unjustly placed upon us, we succeed anyway. And that's the two sort of key points of clash and two key points of substance they made. Before I go on to sort of rebut those, I shall go on to sort of move some minor points of rebuttal. Now, the first proposition speaker opened his case for sort of the justification of Cuba with a very sort of interesting point, saying that we can justify Cuba's success by analysing its successfulness in sort of aiding Marxist terrorist groups in Africa, which is pretty fine. They were certainly successful in that. I've read some of Che Guevara's writings from there. That's where his racist writings come from. He was certainly successful in that regard too. Props to you, props to him. And he sort of yeah, the pretty much that really. I shall now go on to my speech. Now, just to clarify, like, what our main point is, this has not been a debate on, like, sort of, despite the sort of attempted framing by the first speaker, we're not really addressing this in a capitalism versus socialism line. We're sort of arguing a little perspective that, like, even if you are a socialist, you should agree with us on this proposition, right? You know, acknowledging when things go wrong in your ideology does not invalidate your ideology, in fact, makes it stronger, right? If I'm a nationalist and I say, hey, maybe Trump isn't all that good, maybe Bolsonaro isn't all that good, that doesn't invalidate my nationalism, it just makes my nationalism stronger and more valid. And if you're a socialist, you do not have to go to bat for the worst actors of socialism. That does not help you. And we think that if you are in that field, you should be siding with us, naturally. Because indeed, tying your mass is sort of a sinking ship represents the worst cases of sort of Marxist state capitalism, the worst examples of sort of power based on hereditary value. This to me does not represent socialism, this represents to me sort of the worst aspects of any sort of government. And I don't think you should go to bat for this Cuban government, as it is a failure of socialism. Now I want to sort of, my point is I've got here somewhere, which I do have here somewhere, a very good organisation here. Okay, yeah, so I want to sort of key points of clash. Now, the speaker brought up, sort of brought up the nature of healthcare and resources. And they say, well, Cuba has such great healthcare, Cuba has a lot of doctors, Cuba has great literacy. Assuming we acknowledge these numbers to be true, which we can't really, right? Because the thing about sort of authoritarian states, we can't really validate the numbers they're giving us. The healthcare they have, the literacy, it's totally based on like their self-reporting. And, no, thank you. And the authoritarian dictatorship, I don't really trust those numbers all that much. But let's say you're axiomatically true. Let's say for the purpose of the debate, we believe you that Cuba is in fact this utopia of literacy and healthcare and doctoring. Now that good stuff. As sort of the second speaker here has sort of rebutted, in that while the state does give you these resources are completely dependent on being loyal to a abusive totalitarian state, which does not tolerate any sort of degree of dissent. And your access to those resources is completely dependent on your obedience to that state. Therefore, sort of a circular argument where you have to sort of tie the abuse together resources, and this is somehow a success. I don't really get how that argument falls through. I think it's been invalidated and rebutted by the second speaker. And you also go into sort of the nature of the embargo, which I myself rebutted a little bit, saying that the embargo is actually the embargo is the result of Cuban foreign policy, right? The embargo was the result of Castro's policy saying, hey, let's nationalize pretty much all the investment of the let's nationalize all U.S. investment. And then be surprised that people around the world no longer wish to invest in us. No, thank you. It's saying, hey, we can essentially steal millions of dollars of American property and capital, and we can essentially point nukes at them. But if they embargo us, well, that's just unfair. No, I think the fact, no, thank you. I think the fact that they created a scenario in which case they got themselves embargo really represents sort of, as my other colleague said there, the sort of innate flaws of a totalitarian state where one single loony madman can essentially really down the drain real quickly. And that shows sort of the inefficiency of politics and the inefficiency of government. Where you would choose to go to war with your closest ally, the closest, richest nation, and you would say, hey, our burgeoning new right country, let's go to war for our closest, richest ally. This is a real good idea. I say this is a failure of an idea, and the absolute state of decay of Cuba is an example of that failure. I take your point.
Yeah, I mean, you're saying Cubans actively decided to go to war with America. Ever since the day Castro got into power, there were literal plans to assassinate and kill him.
Literally untrue. Castro was literally invited to Washington, they were very amicable with him. What you're saying is just sort of factually incorrect. Maybe it's part of the sort of fake news Cuban victimhood narrative, but really it doesn't really hold much weight compared to actually factual scrutiny. Cuba, he was invited to Washington, and Washington was not hostile to him. When he started nationalizing their investments, yeah, a little bit of hostility did start. That's what happens when you steal from people. They get a bit mad at you, which is why you as a leader should not do that, because that would be a failure of you to do that. We argue that's why Cuba can be classified as a failure. Because repeatedly the Castro regime makes failed decisions, failed economic decisions, failed foreign policy decisions. They support Marxist terrorists in Africa. They go to war with their rich neighbours. Everything Castro has done has been an abject failure by every objective standard we have. People only go to bat for him because they fear that if they acknowledge that things have gone badly, then their precious socialist ideology will be discredited, which I've said is not the case. If you are socialist, you should be disavowing bad actors, and I will join in with you. Just because Castro's bad does not mean socialism is bad, right? Sort of get in with us, right? We want to help you. We all want to work together to disavow authoritarianism. We all want to work together to sort of disavow and disincentivize this sort of bad means of governance, right? So yeah, get into it. To sort of wrap up real quick. When we say Cuba has been a failure, we're sort of saying it in the sense of failure, just to fail to fulfill the goals of the revolution, right? Castro promised, when he came to office, promised a free, prosperous Cuba, and he promised a representative government. Instead, he delivered a USSR puppet state that sort of put the country into turmoil, put the country into a state of authoritarianism. But really, we have to ask, is it really all that much better off than when they had the revolution? It all seems to have gone through a complete 180. And we say it's a failure because we can imagine an alternative scenario, right? We can imagine a Cuba where the revolution happens, and then in fact, instead of nationalizing U.S. interests, how about a scenario where the revolution happens, then you form representative democracy? How about a scenario where instead of nationalizing U.S. goods, you tax them like a normal country? Right? We say under these scenarios, had Castro not done what he did, Cuba would have been a success. But he didn't, therefore we classify it as an abject failure by every objective means of standard that we have. And that is why you should object the motion. Thank you.
I would like to thank Mr. Dillon for his speech, and I think we should all give him a round of applause for his maiden speech. It's this bit now, it's time for questions. So, I think we've all learned a lot this evening, so I hope there are a good few questions from both of the sides. So, are there any questions for the proposition? Well, how very, very disappointing. Anyone else?
Can I ask a question? Am I allowed?
Yeah, you'll be on now.
Cool. Can I ask one?
Yeah.
Alright, boys, so John Rawls, big John Rawls, wrote a big book called The Theory of Justice. I think it's a pretty good book. He laid out a scheme for redistribution of justice and that, so like distributing wealth to people in society, which could take the form of a welfare state, arguably, but you know, he had two principles of justice, and that was actually the second one, like goods should be redistributed in a way that was just. His first principle was always that civil rights and civil liberty should be upheld like freedom, because without that kind of agency, you can't actually use the goods in any meaningful way. So do you not think by sort of upholding the purported economic benefits of Cuba and completely ignoring the infraction of civil liberties, you're actually ignoring completely what makes life worthwhile?
We didn't ignore that civil liberties, we did mention it. And we're not saying off for the fact that civil liberties have been pushed in aspects of Cuba. I would say that actually John Rawls is right from a very Western perspective, and a lot of the ideas of civil liberties are very Western. And actually, you can't have civil liberty if you're living in poverty. If you can't afford to eat, then you don't have civil liberty. As much as you might have the right to work or whatever written in legislation, you don't have the right to work when you have no food. You don't have those rights that we enshrine if you are paying £50 for cancer treatment that you can't afford and have to die from diseases that are preventable because healthcare is not affordable. So I think it is actually a very Western perspective. And if you look at a lot of countries that aren't from the West and what they prioritise bread and rice, or bread and roses, which I think it takes us away from the idea of actually human rights as something that's so ingrained in capitalism and Western culture. Whilst I do, as someone who...
I'd like to ask you to wrap up, please.
But I think we should broaden our perspective on what rights actually are.
Opposition to respond?
Yeah, I'll take that. Sort of the argument that people... What?
Please stand.
Oh, okay. So the case making is that people need access to resources in order to be prosperous and free, which is like sort of positive freedom, which I can buy. But before the Castro regime, Cuba was one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America, or South America. Now it's one of the poorest. And you're making a case, well, now they have access to so much more resources, when actually they objectively lack access to so much less resources. So, like, how does your sort of theory here stand up?
No. That's just the way it goes. So, are there any questions towards the opposition? Mr. McGuinness.
So a couple of times you've made reference to Cuba's nationalisation of the sort of property of American companies, and this is something, this is why America's, stance towards them is justified. But when you consider the historic record of horrendous human rights abuses committed by American companies in South America, not just Cuba, across South America, surely, nationalising these companies and shutting them down is probably the most sensible policy for any government in those countries to make.
Or you could do the thing where you just tax them. Like, it doesn't really matter who owns the mine. It's a matter of how the mine is taxed. All those resources are redistributed to the people. It seems to me that if you just said, hey, we're going to let Americans have their investments, but tax them at a reasonable rate, and bring that back to the people, that seems to be a much better solution than just steal it, just nationalize it, and then get embargoed and be like, oh, what happened? We are the victims. No, you're just unsuccessful. We have a good thing.
Say it doesn't matter who owns the mine. You're wrong. It does matter who owns the mine. An unsuccessful country is one that allows foreign interests to buy out their natural resources and to essentially extract wealth from their citizens. What Cuba did when they nationalized American investments in Cuba was to take that money out of the hands of the richest in America and put it back in the hands of the poorest in Cuba. And you can say that this is why the embargo happened. Yeah, the embargo happened because Cuba opposed American interests. That doesn't mean that Cuba should have done that, is what I'm saying. Cuba doing that was a good thing, because if they hadn't done it, then America would continue to extract as much wealth from Cuba as they possibly could, like they do in every other third world country in the world.
Okay. Now for any abstaining points. This is a reminder to the entire group, these are points that are directed to both sides, a single point to both sides, rather than a point that's kind of disguised as one for another side. Okay? Mr. McGinnis.
This is just something that I think we sort of skirted around a little bit in the debate. I don't know any sides really properly defined what would you consider to be a successful state.
Yes, Proposition John.
I would consider a state which can feed its population, which can take care of its elderly, ensure its homelessness have food, ensure that everyone has the right to a house, ensure that there's medical access, which, contrary to what the opposition were claiming here, is considered the best in the world, and is ultimately one that is a caring, compassionate state which looks after its population and has a high happiness level, the very definition of a successful state. And the only reason to argue Cuba isn't is because of Western propaganda, which does not want it to be a successful state, as it proves that the economic system of communism in Cuba does work.
A higher happiness level is the definition for a successful state. What utilitarian nonsense. We cannot judge the success of a state purely off of its happiness level. That's nonsensical. We completely reject that notion. So how do you define a successful state? Well, I think, quite clearly laid out, and I'll re-clarify if necessary, that a successful state is one which guarantees and enshrines the freedom of its people. It allows people to live to their fullest potential. I think that's what we want to hammer home. A successful state is one in which the social structure allows people to live their fullest potential and express their lives how they see fit. Cuba is not a successful state in our view because it does not allow for that. It does not allow people to live their lives as they see fit because it restricts upon their social freedoms. Cuba allows the people to live a very specific vision of life. It allows people to live a vision of life that is this sort of pseudo-idealized communist, not really utopia, actually kind of dystopia, in which the second you speak out against the government or question any of its policies, which you might rightfully want to do, you are berated, you are locked in jail, and the key is thrown away. This is completely different to the structure of Western society. You claim that the UK criticises people who talk out against the government, and that's the same thing, because we criticise people, therefore it's objectively the same as throwing them in prison. No, it's very, very different. It is not comparable, and that's why we consider Cuba to be a failed state.
Okay. I forgot, that was an abstaining point. I completely forgot where we were. It happens to me far too often. So we'll go back right to the beginning again. Any questions for the proposition? Go on, try a bit harder. Unfortunately, speakers can't offer questions. No.
Speakers can't offer details.
Mr. Finley, do you have a question?
The proposition case seems to have largely been through the use of interesting phrases like, yes, there are human rights abuses, but that if a system or a government or whatever you want to call it produces well-being for its citizens, that's to be the priority, and therefore the defects of the system are kind of outweighed by that. And that's what success looks like. So, by that yardstick, what systems would you regard as failures? What system, capitalism produces wealth for some people, produces comfort for quite a lot, and prosperity for quite a lot of people, but yes, it has problems as well, by a similar line of thought that you've espoused. So, what does failure look like?
The reason why we almost skirt over the negative issues is because our minds haven't closed, just like Guantanamo Bay. I don't think you can look at any country around the world and it is morally pure. I don't think that exists, person or any group has morally pure and is not successful. So it's an inherently difficult thing to define. I think if we take what is the very basics, it's alive, it's food, it's safety. And yes, you can pick up Cuba on issues of do you feel safe if you're from a certain country. But there's stuff like that in the UK. Do you feel safe if you're a Muslim in the UK? I know a lot of Muslims who do not. Is that a human rights abuse? I think the problem with such a black and white success failure is I don't think anyone's morally pure. I think we're all a little bit fucked. That's fine. Sorry, I was quoting Biggie Smalls. So I think you just have to look at and balance actually what can you do with the world that it is. How do you balance those morals and what can you give and take? And generally, I think they don't follow that.
So, how is it different? Because we will accept the notion that there are problems with every system, there are strengths and flaws to everything, but why is Cuba's system particularly bad when compared to ours? The difference is, in a Western capitalist democracy, or just a Western democracy in general, because you make more shits in regards to that and how heavily you implement things, yes, there are problems in the structure of the society, there are things that need fixed. However, the problem with Cuba, and the reason it's so much worse in Cuba's instances, is because the problems are enshrined in the very structure of the state. The problems are enshrined in the nature of a one-party system. They are enshrined in the lack of democracy. They are enshrined in the cracking down on actual expression and cracking down on the ability to have a say on how to express yourself freely. So whilst Western countries can vote people in, they can change laws, they can provide welfare systems to help people, Cuba's very nature as a one-party state enshrines that it will always have this flaw of poor succession, it will always have this flaw of not being able to actually provide people with free expression, and it will always be just worse in regards to how it treats people. And again, this is why we think we take these points.
Now, are there any questions for the opposition in the room? Any at all? Go on, have a try. Someone. No? No questions for the opposition as well. Yeah. I'm not going to keep going. I could be here all night. That would just be really sad. Any abstaining points? Oh my God. There's not one for the opposition, but there's an abstaining one. Mr. Colin McGowan, abstain.
This was really for the opposition.
But why didn't you say? Don't try to break me! Is that an abstaining point? Sure. It's actually an abstaining point.
Please, it better be.
It actually doesn't matter at this point. Say it.
So, should we judge a country's success based on their weakest link? And if not, why not? Does that make sense? The weakest link, the worst thing that could happen in that country.
Yeah, you're making something.
So that would be the opposition to respond first.
Well, it would depend on the weakest link you're talking about. If you're talking about one instance where you're put in prison for having dissenting opinions and so many abuses of human rights versus another country where the issue is that they don't have public health care, I think a bit of a false equivalence in my opinion would be quite a simple answer to that.
Proposition?
Yeah, I do. I think that the measure by which we judge society is by how they treat the worst off in that society. And I think that Cuba actually does a little better than we do in that regard. Because in Cuba, there's no beggars, there's no homeless, no one starves, no one dies of cancer because they can't afford treatment. Well, that doesn't happen here either. It does happen in other developed countries. And I think that, honestly, the fact that Cuban citizens don't have the right to say bad things about their governments is bad, but it's not as bad as the fact that on the streets of Belfast there are people who are sleeping rough and can't afford food.
Okay, I think the appetite for questions is pretty much gone at this point. I think we know all we need to know about Cuba, so it's that time. Get your membership cards ready. It's time for the vote on speakerability. This is the vote on which side you think spoke best. So get them cards out. I'm waiting. So, for those of you that think, oh, I think I've not got my cards. I need you all ready. Need you all ready for this vote? So, for those of you who think that the proposition spoke better this evening, please raise your membership cards and say aye.
Oof.
There's no surrender.
What's going on? This is what a Cuban election looks like.
So for those of you who think that the opposition spoke better, please raise your membership cards and say nay.
Nay.
Going on.
And those of you who have no opinion, think they both spoke equally well, equally terribly, or just don't care, please raise your membership cards and say meh.
You can't follow attention.
I was about to say, it's funny that like Hugh and I disagree on the numbers every week, yet there's been complete agreement tonight. Just like the first time that's happened. So, Mr. Secretary,
That's something we dig.
if I was going to dig, it would be my own grave, Mr. McArdle. Oh, there had to be a dark joke somewhere, didn't there? Mr. Secretary, read back the vote.
So on the motion that this House believes Cuba has been a success, there were 4 ayes, 11 nays and 3 abstentions. So the nays have it.
The nays have it, ladies and gentlemen. The nays have it. As you may have noticed throughout the questions section, I was looking down at my phone for news from the SE Awards. It seems that award hasn't been called yet, so I can't give you news at the moment, but it will be shared appropriately depending on the outcome.
Is there a cash prize?
I don't think so. No, but it gives them more receptive to giving you grants and stuff, so yeah. There's a subtle catch.
So I would like to thank everyone for coming the day after the conversation. I recognise that most of the society was completely wrecked after it, and I hope you all had a good time this evening. So at the end, speakers to the front for a photograph, and those of you who are wanting to socialise, go to Lavery's into the roof garden bit. And so I hereby declare this meeting adjourned.